The big courtroom in Tampa, Florida had seen many fights before. But today was going to be different. No one in the room knew it yet. Not even Judge Alan Walter. The wooden doors of the courtroom swung open. A woman walked inside. She wasn't just any woman. Her name was Pam Bondi, and she was one of the sharpest lawyers around. She held a black briefcase in one hand. With the other, she adjusted her blazer. This case was supposed to be easy. Pam had argued many cases before. This was just another normal day. Or so she thought. As she walked to her seat, she felt Judge Walter's eyes on her. But he wasn't looking at her face. He was staring at her necklace. It was a small gold cross. The room became quiet. Then Judge Walter spoke in a voice as sharp as a knife. "Miss Bondi, I must tell you," he said. "There is no place for religious symbols in my courtroom." Pam didn't blink. She didn't look shocked. She just stood there waiting for him to explain himself. But then the judge said something even more surprising. "Take off that cross," he said, "or you will have to pay a fine." A soft murmur spread across the courtroom. People in the room looked at each other. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably. The court clerk glanced at the judge, then at Pam. This was not normal. Judges were supposed to control the courtroom. But finding a lawyer just because of a necklace? That was strange. Pam didn't move. She didn't even touch the cross. Instead, she looked at Judge Walter. Her voice was calm. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," she said, "but my cross is no different than a wedding ring." She smiled just a little. "Would you find someone wearing a locket with a family picture inside?" The judge's face was hard to read. "That's not how I see it," he said with a sigh. "Either remove it or I will have to fine you for breaking the rules." Pam still didn't move. She didn't care about the fine. She cared about what it meant. And she was not about to back down. Pam set down her briefcase. Then she looked at the judge. "Your Honor, before we move forward, I'd like to talk about this issue." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Talk about it?" he repeated. "Yes," Pam said, nodding. "I am filing an objection." She sat down and folded her hands on the table. Judge Walter chuckled. "Miss Bondi," he said, "this case is about a business dispute, not your personal issues." Pam didn't even flinch. She leaned forward. "Well, Your Honor," she said, "I am also aware that the First Amendment doesn't take a break for anyone's personal opinions." The judge's eyes narrowed. The court reporter sat up straighter. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. The room was silent. People were no longer just watching a normal trial. They were watching something bigger. Pam was doing something very rare. She was challenging the judge. And she was doing it right to his face. Pam took a deep breath. Then she spoke again. "Your Honor, you are fining me because of my cross." She looked around the courtroom. "Let's break that down, shall we?" Judge Walter sighed. He rubbed his temples. "Miss Bondi, I don't have time for this." Pam reached into her briefcase. She wasn't just going to argue. She was about to destroy his argument. Pam pulled out one piece of paper. She set it on the table carefully. She didn't rush. Every second she stayed silent made the room more tense. The judge sighed again. "Miss Bondi," he said, "I don't have time for your drama." Pam smiled politely. "Neither do I, Your Honor." She tapped the paper. "But I do have time for the law." Judge Walter leaned forward. His fingers were folded together. He was bracing himself. Pam kept her voice calm. "Your Honor, you are saying that my cross breaks the rules of this courtroom." She tilted her head. "But tell me," she said, "what law are you basing that on?" Silence. The courtroom was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. The court reporter stopped typing. The bailiff shifted in his seat. Judge Walter exhaled slowly. "This courtroom operates under my authority, Miss Bondi," he said. Pam nodded. "Yes, it does," she said. "But that authority is not above the Constitution." She tapped the paper again. "And under the First Amendment, personal religious expression is protected." The judge scoffed. "You're a lawyer," he said. "Not a law professor." Pam smiled again. "Then let's talk about case law." She picked up the paper. Tinker versus Des Moines, 1969. Judge Walter froze. Pam continued. "That case proved that people do not lose their constitutional rights just because they walk into a government building." She set the paper down. "Would you like me to keep going?" she asked. The judge's jaw tightened. He knew that case. Everyone did. But Pam wasn't finished. West Virginia versus Barnett, 1943. She tapped the table. "The Supreme Court ruled that people cannot be forced to hide their personal beliefs." She folded her arms. "So, Your Honor, would you like me to list more cases?" The judge didn't answer. The judge's fingers tapped on his chair. His face was calm, but Pam knew he was trapped. He had two choices. Keep arguing and risk looking foolish. Find a way to backtrack without looking weak. Judge Walter finally turned to the clerk. His voice was low. Mark the fine as pending review. Pam smirked. I'll take that as a temporary victory. But she wasn't done yet. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been told to hide their faith. She had started a battle. And she had no plans to lose. Judge Walter had made one mistake. He thought he could silence Pam Bondi. He had no idea what he was up against. And now the whole courtroom knew it. Ms. Bondi sat straight in her chair. She was ready. Across from her, Judge Walter looked serious. His voice was calm and firm as he spoke. Ms. Bondi, he said, choosing his words carefully, courtroom rules exist for a reason. If I allow one kind of personal expression, I have to allow all of them. Pam Bondi's lips pressed tightly together. You mean, she said, her voice strong, like the wedding rings that half the attorneys in this room are wearing? Judge Walter's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Pam didn't stop. Or what about the small lapel pins that you allow government officials to wear? You have no problem with those. The judge's fingers curled slightly around his desk, his face remaining stiff. Pam leaned forward slightly. And let's not forget, she continued, that you once allowed a defense attorney to wear a pink ribbon for breast cancer awareness during a trial. You didn't stop him. You didn't fine him. A few people in the courtroom murmured quietly. Some of them nodded, others exchanged knowing glances. Judge Walter glared at them as if trying to silence them without speaking. But it was too late. Pam had just exposed his unfair actions. She sat back in her chair, crossing her arms. So, tell me, Your Honor, she said, her voice sharp, why does this rule apply only to me? Judge Walter gripped his desk tightly. Everyone in the courtroom could see it now. He had created a rule just for her. A rule he had never used before. A rule based on his personal feelings, not the law. Now that rule was falling apart. For the first time since the hearing began, Judge Walter had no answer. Pam didn't have to rub it in. She just let the silence grow. She let everyone in the courtroom think about what had just happened. Then after a long pause, she spoke again. If you stand by this ruling, fine, she said, her voice steady. But I will file an appeal before the ink even dries on the paperwork. She leaned forward slightly. And when I do, she added, this case will make headlines. She let that sink in. A sitting judge fined a woman for wearing a cross in court, she continued. I'm sure the higher courts would love to give their opinion on that. The judge's nostrils flared. He was caught between two choices, his pride and the cold, hard truth. Pam stared at him. She wasn't backing down. The longer he stayed silent, the worse it looked for him. Finally, after what felt like forever, Judge Walter let out a sharp breath. The fine is rescinded, he muttered, barely looking at her. Pam smiled. Much appreciated, Your Honor. The judge's words, the fine is rescinded. That should have ended everything. But it didn't. The courtroom had changed. It wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a moment people would remember. The court reporter barely looked up from her keyboard, but she knew this transcript would be shared far beyond this room. The clerk, who had seemed uncomfortable earlier when the fine was announced, now glanced at Pam with newfound respect. Judge Walter shifted in his chair. He straightened his papers as if trying to erase the moment. But Pam knew better. This wasn't something he could just move on from. The silence in the room was deafening. Pam calmly adjusted her blazer. The small gold cross was still in place, exactly where it had been the whole time. She had won. But this wasn't just her victory. It had to mean something more. She turned to her client, a middle-aged business owner. The man gave her a small nod, a nod filled with respect. His trust in her had only grown stronger. Pam knew this moment was bigger than her. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was immediate. A reporter who had been covering a different case heard what happened. Within an hour, a news website posted a headline. Florida judge attempts to fine attorney for wearing a cross, but it doesn't go as planned. Pam's phone buzzed. Then again. And again. Colleagues, law school classmates, journalists, people wanted to know what happened. But Pam didn't care about headlines or media attention. She was thinking bigger. Pam knew this case was not just about her. Would other judges try the same thing in the future? Would lawyers feel pressured to leave personal symbols at home? Would this case change how courts handle personal beliefs? She wasn't going to let that happen. That evening, the story exploded. A legal expert on a conservative news channel mentioned it during a panel discussion. On social media, heated debates broke out. Some people supported the judge, saying courts should be neutral. Others saw Pam stand as an important fight for rights. Pam sat in her office, watching the discussion unfold on her phone. A TV producer reached out asking for an interview. She sighed, rubbing her temple. Pam had spent years fighting for clients. She had been in high-stakes cases before. But this was different. This wasn't about money or business. This was about freedom. Could a single judge decide what personal symbols were allowed? Could he take away someone's right to wear a cross just because he didn't like it? Pam knew the answer. No, she could feel it. He wasn't going to forget this battle. And she wasn't done fighting either. Pam knew that this case was just the beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next. That night, Pam sat in silence looking at her cross. She thought about what had happened. She had won this fight, but there were so many others like it. People who were pressured to hide who they were. People who were told they didn't belong. Pam knew she had to keep fighting, because this wasn't just about a fine. It wasn't just about a courtroom battle. This was about something much bigger. And Pam Bondi was not backing down. As Pam walked out of the courthouse that day, she could still remember the way Judge Walter had looked at her. Before he hit the big wooden hammer, the gavel, on the table and ended the session, there had been something in his eyes. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was a challenge. Pam didn't know exactly what it meant, but she could feel it deep inside. This wasn't over. She had won today, but Walter wasn't the type to just forget and move on. Pam expected something to happen next. Maybe she'd get a few emails from other lawyers. Maybe some phone calls from colleagues asking about what had happened. But what she didn't expect was how fast everything would go wrong. Pam walked into her office the next morning like any other day. But something was different. Her assistant, Emily, was already waiting for her. Emily's face looked worried. "You need to see this," Emily said, holding up her tablet. Pam took the tablet from her hands. She scanned the screen, reading quickly. The Florida Bar Association had just released a statement. It was very formal and polite, but Pam could see the real meaning behind the words. Judges have the right to keep order in their courtrooms. Lawyers can express themselves, but they must also respect the rules of the judge. We trust our legal system to handle these situations fairly. Pam let out a slow breath. This wasn't just a simple statement. This was a warning. The words "respect the rules of the judge" weren't just random words. They were a message, and that message was meant for her. Pam knew how the legal world worked. The Florida Bar Association almost never got involved in courtroom arguments. Unless someone powerful was pushing from behind the scenes. And that meant Judge Walter wasn't done with her. He wasn't just angry. He was already moving pieces in the background. He was trying to turn the system against her. Pam set the tablet down. "This was published today?" she asked. Emily nodded. "An hour ago." Pam wasn't surprised. She knew how fast news could spread in their world. And now she knew that Walter wasn't backing down. But before she could say anything else, Emily hesitated. "There's more," she said carefully. Pam looked up, her face calm but serious. "Go on," she said. Emily handed her a printed paper. Pam skimmed the first few lines. Her heart stayed steady, but her mind was racing. The paper was a formal complaint. It said, "Attorney Pamela Bondi disrupted the courtroom, disrespected the judge, and acted in a way that was not proper for a lawyer." Pam couldn't help it. She let out a short, dry laugh. "Unbecoming?" she repeated, shaking her head. "That's rich." Emily sighed. "It's retaliation," she said. "It's obvious. Walter is mad, and now he's trying to get back at you." Pam leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers on the armrest. This wasn't just revenge. This was a lesson. Walter wanted to set an example. He wanted to show everyone. If you challenge me in my courtroom, this is what happens to you. He had lost control in the courtroom that day. And now he was using the system to get his control back. By filing this complaint, Walter was trying to change the story. He wasn't the judge who went too far. He was now the judge who had been wronged. And Pam? He wanted the world to see her as the reckless lawyer who just caused trouble for no reason. Pam had seen this move before. It was a common trick. Turn the accuser into the accused. Make the real problem disappear behind paperwork and legal talk. But Pam wasn't about to let that happen. "What's the process for this?" Pam asked. Emily exhaled. "You have 10 days to respond," she said. "If the complaint moves forward, there will be a formal review." Pam nodded. "And who's in charge of that review?" Emily hesitated. "A panel of judges and senior attorneys." Pam almost smiled. If Walter thought this would be handled quietly, he was wrong. This wasn't going to be hidden behind closed doors. It was about to become very public. Emily studied her, waiting for a response. "What do you want to do?" she asked. Pam took a deep breath. Then she reached for her phone. "If Walter wants to play games," she said, scrolling through her contacts. "Let's play." Pam didn't waste time. She knew exactly how these things worked. When powerful people wanted revenge, they did it in the shadows. Walter wanted to keep this quiet. He wanted to use the rules against her while keeping the public in the dark. Pam wasn't going to let that happen. She dialed a number. The call rang once, twice, then, "Hello." A voice answered. Pam leaned forward in her chair. "I need a favor," she said. The person on the other end paused. Then they responded, "I'm listening." Pam smiled. This was just the beginning. Pam knew what Walter expected. He thought she would stay quiet. He thought she would go to a private hearing, accept the punishment, and move on. But that was his mistake. Pam had spent her entire career fighting battles smartly. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. She planned. And now she was going to make sure everyone was watching. Step 1, call the press. Let the public know what was happening. Step 2, gather support. She had friends, powerful ones. If Walter thought no one would stand with her, he was wrong. Step 3, flip the story. She wasn't the one on trial. Walter was. She had seen judges abuse power before. She had fought them before. And every time she came out stronger. Pam looked at Emily. "Make some calls," she said. Emily nodded. The fight had begun. And this time, Pam wasn't going to lose. Pam was sitting in her office, scrolling through her phone. She found the contact she needed and pressed call. The phone rang twice and then a familiar voice answered. "Pam, I was just about to call you." It was Samantha Lawson, a famous journalist who worked for a big news program about legal issues. She had written stories about some of Pam's biggest cases before. But more importantly, Samantha was brave. She wasn't scared to speak out when judges or officials abused their power. Pam didn't waste any time. "Samantha, listen carefully," she said. "A judge just filed a complaint against me. He says I disrupted the courtroom." Samantha was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What happened?" Pam took a deep breath. "He tried to fine me just because I was wearing a cross. When I refused to take it off, he backed down. But now he's trying to punish me another way, by using his power to get me in trouble." Samantha was silent again. Then she let out a sharp breath. "Are you telling me a judge is trying to punish you because you stood up to him?" Pam smiled slightly. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." Samantha didn't hesitate. "I'm running this story, Pam," she said quickly. Pam leaned forward. "I need it on record before they try to change the story. Once it's public, Judge Walter won't be able to hide this. He won't be able to make it seem like it's just a small rule-breaking issue." Samantha was already typing notes on her computer. "I'll have the story up by tomorrow," she promised. "I'll also have legal experts talk about it on the news, especially ones who aren't afraid to say what this really is." Pam felt something shift. Momentum. Things were finally moving in her favor. But she wasn't done yet. She turned to Emily, her assistant. "Write a public statement," Pam said firmly. "I want to make my position clear before Walter and his friends try to twist the story." Emily nodded. "You want to say this is about judges having too much power?" Pam shook her head. "I want to say it's exactly what it is, an attack on personal rights. This is about a judge abusing his power. If he thinks he can punish me for standing up for myself, imagine what he's done to people who don't have a voice." Emily's expression hardened. "I'll get it done." Pam let out a breath, gathering her thoughts. Judge Walter had been counting on silence. But now the whole country was about to find out exactly what he had done. Pam didn't have to wait long. The next morning she sat down with her coffee, ready for another long day. But before she could even take a sip, her phone started buzzing nonstop. News channels had picked up Samantha's story overnight. Social media was on fire. The headline was everywhere. "Florida judge tries to punish attorney for wearing a cross. Now he's in trouble." It wasn't just one type of news outlet covering the story. Left-wing, right-wing, and independent news channels were all talking about it. Legal experts from different backgrounds were giving their opinions. A famous law professor from Georgetown went on live television and shook his head at the judge's actions. "This is a clear abuse of power," he said. "There is no law that says a lawyer cannot wear a religious symbol in court. What Judge Walter did was wrong and completely unfair." Another high-profile lawyer posted a long thread online, explaining step by step how Pam's case had exposed a big problem in the legal system. And then, the moment Pam had been waiting for arrived. The Florida Judicial Review Board, a group of people who investigate judges, made a public statement. Because of all the media attention, they announced that they would officially review Judge Walter's behavior. They wanted to see if his actions had broken the rules for how judges were supposed to behave. Pam leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every attorney, every defendant, and every person who had ever stepped into a courtroom, wondering if their rights would be taken away with just a few words from a judge. Emily walked in, holding up her phone. "You're going to want to see this," she said. Pam took the phone and pressed play. On the screen was Judge Walter. He stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by flashing cameras. His expression was tight. He was giving a statement. It was short. Too short for someone who wanted to defend themselves properly. "I have always upheld the integrity of my courtroom," Walter said stiffly. "The actions taken were meant to maintain neutrality. However, I respect the review process and will cooperate fully." Pam almost laughed. "Neutrality?" she muttered. He was still trying to make it sound like he was just being fair. Emily crossed her arms. "He's trying to save his reputation." Pam nodded. "And he's failing," she said, "because this wasn't going away." The Judicial Review Board had a decision to make. If they ruled against Walter, it wouldn't just be embarrassing for him. It would set a legal rule, a rule that said judges couldn't punish people for wearing religious symbols in court. But even if they didn't officially punish him, Walter had already lost where it mattered most. His reputation, his credibility, his authority. Because after this, every lawyer who stepped into his courtroom would know. This was the judge who tried to silence someone, and lost. Pam took a slow sip of her coffee, letting it all sink in. Then she looked up at Emily. "We won," she said. Emily smirked. "Oh, I know." Pam set her cup down. She hadn't just fought for herself. She had sent a message that said, "Never let someone in power take away your rights without a fight." Because sometimes all it takes is one person standing up to change everything. The next few weeks were busy. Pam did interviews on television, explaining why this wasn't just about her case. It was about every lawyer and every citizen who faced unfair treatment in court. More and more people came forward, sharing their own experiences of judges abusing their power. The pressure on the Judicial Review Board grew stronger. Finally, after weeks of investigation, they made their decision. They ruled that Judge Walter had violated judicial ethics. His actions were wrong, and his attempt to punish Pam was unacceptable. While he wasn't removed from his position, he was officially reprimanded. His name would always be linked to this case. He had lost the respect of his fellow judges. And the next time he tried to abuse his power, everyone would be watching. Pam had done more than just win, she had changed the system. And she knew one thing for sure. No judge would ever try to pull the same stunt again. If you enjoyed this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more exciting stories filled with adventure, mystery, and unforgettable moments. Your support means the world. It keeps these stories coming and the creativity flowing. Thanks for watching, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.